sometimes think other people are not as alarmed as I am about some of the things. If you look at the planet from outer space now, it looks way different than it did 40 years ago. There's half as much ice at the top of the planet. Stuff like that's not supposed to happen in 40 years. We had the human civilization arose in this 10,000 years of the Holocene when essentially nothing happened, you know, climatically on the planet. You know, couldn't have been more benign. We're sailing into very scary waters. Sorry, that was a rambling answer to a question.
Just raise your hand. You were talking about the sea ice. I read an article recently that NASA reported the Antarctic sea ice is at its greatest extent.
Yes.
Now it seems there's a relation between the two. Do you know anything about that?
Sure. So Antarctic sea ice is a very different phenomenon. Okay, it's transient every year. It comes and goes, and there is more of it. And the reason, to the degree that anyone can explain why there's more of it, there have been two big papers. Clearly, one reason is that the westerly winds have increased, and the best explanation has to do with the hole in the ozone that we caused by putting chlorofluorocarbons in the atmosphere. It's created a kind of vortex that's causing those winds to whirl in that way. The other thing that's apparently going on is Antarctica in general, forget the sea ice, the Antarctica in general is warming and it's losing ice mass. We know from these huge, from these measures of gravity that the GRACE satellites perform. And in fact, some of the glaciers, especially in the Antarctic Peninsula, are really starting to disintegrate. The Pine Island Glacier, most importantly, which is scary. They're being undercut by warmer water. But as we raise the temperature, one of the things that happens is you get warm air holds more water vapor than cold. So we're getting more turnover, and there's more rain and hence more fresh water in the Antarctic than there was, which freezes more easily. Mm-hmm. So that's the best conjecture at the moment as to what's going on. But it doesn't, sometimes they're like climate deniers say, oh, well, who cares, the Arctic's melted, but the Antarctic, I mean, it's sort of like saying, like,
put it somewhere else.
Well, it's sort of like saying, like, my attic's on fire, but my basement's flooding, so what the hell, you know?
Yeah.
It all evens out.
Thank you.
I've got one. We've done a bit of research and are having a hard time finding conclusive reports, I guess, of the idea that governments have begun projects of geoengineering or anything kind of going on with chemtrails. And we were wondering if you knew anything concrete about those programs or if anything has come across your path.
No, I don't. I mean, the closest we've had to a geoengineering project that anybody knows about is this thing that happened in Canada in the last little while.
Yeah.
This guy dumping iron filings into the ocean off BC, which is, I mean, even if this was a good idea, and there's no reason to think that it is, from what we know, the idea that people would just decide to sort of do it on a freelance basis is somewhat underrated, it must be said. We've got enough problems without just sort of people randomly, you know, doing new things to change the chemistry of the atmosphere, the oceans. I mean, that's like everybody back away for a while, you know, just in general.
Mm-hmm. Thanks a lot.
Just to add on that case, that was actually on national radio, mm-hmm. and the lead scientist on that project spoke and was very convinced that this was the answer because it attracted all of the biological wildlife that had previously not been there. Because there still is debris floating across from Japan from the meltdown. And
this is the reason that we have actual scientists who do actual science, you know, and experiments and peer review each other and check each other and stuff. And it's why we don't just encourage people to go out in boats and like create their own. So, you know, maybe there's some chance he's right, but in fact, no one will ever know because they didn't actually do an experiment, you know, they just went ahead. This is stuff you gotta be careful about. Monkeying, I mean, if you think about it, having wrecked one system by filling it with stuff that wasn't there, one should give one even more pause about just deciding you were going to fix it by adding some other thing that wasn't there before. More often we talk about adding sulfur to the atmosphere as a way to block incoming sunlight.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, all of these, if you think about them, are just kind of, I mean, it's like, you know, it's like, I've like, I don't know what the analogy is. I've drunk way too much. Now what else can I put in my system to keep me from feeling hungover? You know, it's just like, the problem is what you did in the first place. You know?
I just wanted to, like, I would encourage any, you know, independent research on geoengineering itself, because there's a lot more to know about it than what we are exposed to in the media. You see it every day, you look in the sky, and you can see clouds forming that weren't there before, and they're put there by, you know, airplanes that have flown by, and, you know, crisscross the sky, and next thing you know, you got an overcast day. So you can see it from the ground, and nowadays, I've been hearing more and more geoengineers come forward on these projects, but independent research is definitely crucial on this topic. So I just wanted to point that out.
Bill, you've been around a while doing this environmental stuff.
Yes.
You said the energy was hopeful in your speech.
Yes.
What's the difference between now and, let's say, 20 years ago, or is there a difference?
Now and 5 years ago, there was no movement. I mean, look, we started 350.org because if you think about it, how weird is it that there's the biggest problem human beings have ever faced, and until we started 350.org, there was no global organization that just took its only mandate dealing with climate change, you know? There was no movement. That's why we consciously set out to start one. And when I say we, I mean me and 7 undergraduates at American College. That's what we had almost exactly 5 years ago when we started. And, you know, with no money and no particular skill, we've built it into something very large, which just goes to prove, not that we're good at this, that there's a great hunger for this kind of stuff out there. And the more we do, the more people come to the fore. And the interesting thing is, the harder things we ask people to do, the more they want to do them. So it's like when we said, come to Washington and get arrested. There hadn't been, you know, the environmental movement hadn't done any large-scale civil disobedience in 30 years, you know, at least. And we had no idea. People were like, yes, thank you. Finally something that feels like it begins to be commensurate with the scale of this problem, you know. In the environmental movement, it wasn't an environmental movement. The environmental organizations and things spent 20 years, you know, basically telling people to change their light bulbs. And at a certain point, everybody figured out, you know, once they changed them, they all figured out, okay, yeah, that's good, and now this hasn't actually stopped this problem, so now what do we do? You know? So now, you know, people are, so I'm very optimistic about that. If you wanted me to be pessimistic for a minute, the thing that scares me is just the speed with which we need to operate. If we had 50 years, I have no doubt we'd do what we needed doing. We don't have 50 years. And that's, you know, becomes more evident with each passing season. You know, it's evident that there's this storm blowing up the East Coast that, if it all goes really badly, will be the worst thing that just about ever happened on the East Coast. The ocean temperature is 5 degrees higher than it should be off the coast of New England. And, you know, that's fuel for storms. There's the guys tonight, the Jeff Masters, the best meteorologist, storm meteorologist on the web, put out a post tonight saying there's a 30% chance that the New York subway system will be flooded with seawater. You know, if that happens, you know, God only knows what happens, you know, Tuesday morning. You know? I mean,